The Cincinnati morning air hung thick with humidity as Pete Rose adjusted the rearview mirror of his aging Buick LeSabre. August 15th, 2019. Another day in a life that had become a series of carefully orchestrated public appearances and private regrets. At 78, the man once known as Charlie Hustle carried himself with the same determination that had driven him through 4,256 hits, but now that determination was focused on something far more elusive than baseball records: redemption. Pete had been driving to a memorabilia signing at a sports card shop in Springdale, a routine that had become as predictable as his morning coffee. These events were his lifeline, a way to connect with fans who still remembered him as the scrappy kid from the West Side who dove headfirst into home plate and played every game like it was the World Series. The signing was scheduled for 11, and he was running characteristically early, a habit ingrained from decades of professional discipline. The traffic light at the intersection of Spring Grove Avenue and Mitchell Avenue caught him in its familiar red glow. Pete drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, humming an old Johnny Cash tune his father used to play on the radio during those long summer nights when baseball was just a dream and not a burden. The morning rush was tapering off, but Cincinnati's streets never truly emptied. There was always someone heading somewhere, chasing something. That's when he heard it. "Hey, mister, hey!" The voice was young, urgent, cutting through the ambient noise of idling engines and distant construction. Pete looked around, initially assuming the call was meant for someone else. But then he spotted the source, a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing at the bus stop on the corner. The kid was waving his arms frantically, his school backpack sliding off one shoulder. The boy was thin, with sandy brown hair that stuck up in several directions despite what appeared to be a recent attempt at combing. His jeans were clean but worn, and his Cincinnati Reds t-shirt, a vintage design Pete recognized from the mid-1980s, hung loose on his small frame. Most striking were his eyes, bright blue and filled with a mixture of excitement and desperation that immediately reminded Pete of his own childhood, when every opportunity felt like it might be the last. "You, in the car, I know who you are." Pete's first instinct was to look away. Recognition wasn't always welcome these days. Sometimes it came with judgment, sometimes with disappointment, occasionally with the kind of uncomfortable silence that followed when people didn't know whether to celebrate his achievements or condemn his mistakes. But something in the boy's tone stopped him from turning his head. The kid was now jogging toward his car, and Pete could see him more clearly. There was a determination in his stride that was familiar, the same relentless pursuit that had defined Pete's own approach to life. The boy reached the passenger side window just as Pete was rolling it down, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "You're Pete Rose, aren't you? Charlie Hustle!" The words hit Pete with unexpected force. It had been months since someone had called him by that nickname with genuine enthusiasm rather than ironic detachment. Charlie Hustle, the moniker that had defined his playing career and later became a reminder of everything he'd lost. "Yeah, kid, that's me," Pete replied, managing a smile that felt more genuine than any he'd worn in recent memory. "What's your name?" "Tommy. Tommy Brennan. I can't believe it's really you." The boy's words tumbled out in a rush. "My grandpa talks about you all the time. He says you were the greatest player who ever lived, that you played the game the right way, that you never gave up on anything." Pete felt something tighten in his chest. Compliments about his playing ability weren't rare, but hearing them filtered through the innocent admiration of a child, second-hand from a grandfather's memories, carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. "Your grandpa sounds like a smart man. Does he still follow the Reds?" "Every single game," Tommy said, his eyes lighting up. "He's got this old radio in his workshop, and he listens to every inning while he fixes things. He taught me how to keep score in this old scorebook he's had since he was my age. He says baseball is more than just a game. It's about never quitting, about hustle and heart." The light had turned green, and cars behind Pete were beginning to express their impatience through increasingly aggressive honks. But Pete found himself reluctant to drive away. There was something about this kid, something that reminded him not just of his own youth, but of why he'd fallen in love with baseball in the first place. "Where are you headed, Tommy?" "School. But I missed the bus, and my mom's already at work, and my grandpa." Tommy's expression darkened slightly. "He's not feeling too good lately. I was gonna walk, but it's like 3 miles, and I'm already gonna be late for first period." Pete made a decision that surprised even him. "Hop in, I'll give you a ride." Tommy's face broke into a grin that could have powered the scoreboard at Great American Ballpark. "Seriously? You'd do that?" "Charlie Hustle doesn't leave a teammate stranded," Pete said, the old phrase rolling off his tongue with unexpected ease. As Tommy climbed into the passenger seat, carefully adjusting his backpack and buckling his seatbelt with the deliberate precision of someone who'd been taught to respect rules and opportunities in equal measure, Pete felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of doing something kind without calculation or expectation of return. "So tell me about this grandpa of yours," Pete said as they pulled away from the intersection. "What's his name?" "Frank Brennan. He worked at the Ford plant for 37 years, saved up enough to buy season tickets to the Reds back when you were playing. He's got this whole wall in his garage covered with newspaper clippings from the Big Red Machine days. Pictures of you, Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, Tony Perez, all the greats." Pete navigated through the morning traffic, but his mind was drifting back to those golden years when Cincinnati was the center of the baseball universe. The Big Red Machine, they'd called that team, and for good reason. 2 World Series championships, a lineup that could score runs in bunches, and a city that lived and breathed baseball from April to October. "The 75 and 76 teams," Pete said, more to himself than to Tommy. "Those were special years. Grandpa says 75 was the best World Series ever played, even though you guys lost to Boston. He says Game 6 was the greatest game he ever saw, that Carlton Fisk's home run was beautiful, even though it broke his heart." Pete chuckled, remembering that dramatic October night at Fenway Park. "Your grandpa's right. That was baseball at its finest. Win or lose, you had to respect what happened that night." They drove in comfortable conversation, Tommy sharing stories his grandfather had told him about the glory days, Pete finding himself opening up in ways he hadn't with anyone in months. The kid asked intelligent questions about strategy, about what it felt like to play in front of 50,000 screaming fans, about the pressure of chasing records and living up to expectations. "Grandpa says the hardest part about being great at something is that people expect you to be great at everything," Tommy said as they approached his school. "He says that's not fair, that everyone makes mistakes, that what matters is whether you learn from them and keep trying to be better." The words hit Pete like a line drive to the chest. Here was this 10-year-old boy channeling wisdom from his grandfather, articulating something Pete had been struggling to understand about his own life for 3 decades. The parking lot of Jefferson Elementary School came into view, busy with the organized chaos of late-arriving students and harried parents. "This is it," Tommy said, unbuckling his seatbelt but making no immediate move to get out. "Mr. Rose. Pete, I don't know how to thank you. This is like the coolest thing that's ever happened to me." "You don't need to thank me, Tommy. It's been my pleasure. Your grandpa raised you right." Tommy opened the door, but then turned back, his expression suddenly serious. "Would you... I mean, this is probably asking too much, but would you ever want to meet him? Grandpa Frank. He's been kind of lonely since Grandma died last year, and he's been having some health problems, and I know it would mean everything to him. But I understand if you're too busy or if..." "I'd like that very much," Pete heard himself saying before he'd fully processed the request. "I'd be honored to meet Frank Brennan." The smile that spread across Tommy's face was pure joy, untainted by the complexities that had shadowed Pete's interactions with the adult world for so long. Really? Oh man, he's not going to believe this. When? Where? Pete pulled out his phone and handed it to Tommy. "Put your number in there. I'll call you later this week and we'll figure something out." Tommy entered his information with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of getting details right. As he handed the phone back, the school bell rang in the distance. "I gotta run," Tommy said, "but Pete, Mr. Rose, thank you. Not just for the ride, but for, I don't know, for being who you are, for showing me that heroes can be real people too." And with that, he was gone, backpack bouncing as he jogged toward the school entrance, leaving Pete sitting in his car with tears he didn't fully understand, threatening to spill down his cheeks. The memorabilia signing in Springdale suddenly seemed less important than it had an hour ago. Pete sat in the school parking lot for several minutes, watching the last few stragglers make their way into the building, thinking about grandfathers and grandchildren, about the stories we tell and the legacies we leave behind. For the first time in years, Pete Rose felt like Charlie Hustle again. 3 days passed before Pete called. He'd spent those 72 hours turning the encounter over in his mind, analyzing it the way he used to study opposing pitchers, looking for patterns and meanings that might not have been immediately obvious. The boy's enthusiasm had been genuine, but Pete had learned to be cautious about genuine enthusiasm. Too often it transformed into disappointment when people got close enough to see the man behind the myth. But something about Tommy Brennan had stuck with him. Maybe it was the way the kid had talked about his grandfather with such obvious love and respect, or the casual wisdom he'd shared about greatness and expectations and learning from mistakes. Maybe it was simply that Pete was tired of being suspicious of kindness. He called on Thursday evening after his workout at the local gym, a routine he maintained religiously despite his age, another remnant of professional discipline. Tommy answered on the second ring, his voice immediately brightening with recognition. "Mr. Rose, I was hoping you'd call, but I wasn't sure. I thought maybe you'd forget or get busy or—" "I don't forget promises, Tommy. Charlie Hustle doesn't go back on his word. Grandpa's gonna flip. He's been in his workshop all week working on this old radio, and every time the Reds game comes on, he tells me about some play you made or some hit you got. It's like you're still playing for him, you know?" Pete found himself smiling at the image. What's good for him? Weekends? Evenings? I don't want to interrupt his routine. "Actually," Tommy said, his voice becoming more thoughtful, "Saturday afternoons are when he likes visitors best. That's when he's usually in his workshop, and he's more himself then. Some days are harder than others, you know, but Saturdays are usually good days." There was something in Tommy's tone that suggested more complexity to his grandfather's condition than the boy had initially revealed, but Pete didn't press. Everyone had their struggles, their private battles. He understood better than most what it meant to carry weight that others couldn't see. "Saturday afternoon it is. What's the address?" Tommy provided directions to a house in Price Hill, an older neighborhood on Cincinnati's west side that Pete knew well. It was blue-collar territory, the kind of place where people worked with their hands and followed their teams through good years and bad, where loyalty meant something and respect was earned through consistency rather than flash. "Should I bring anything?" Pete asked. "I've got some old photos, maybe a signed ball." "Just yourself," Tommy replied immediately. "Grandpa always says the best gifts don't come in boxes." Saturday arrived gray and humid, with the kind of overcast sky that promised afternoon thunderstorms. Pete drove through Price Hill's narrow streets, past small houses with well-maintained yards and American flags hanging from front porches. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names and looked out for each other's kids, where tradition mattered and change came slowly. The Brennan house was a modest two-story with white aluminum siding and a front porch that had been recently painted. The lawn was neatly trimmed, and flower boxes under the front windows showed the careful attention of someone who took pride in maintaining what they owned. Pete parked on the street and walked up the concrete path, noting the way the afternoon light caught the small details. Wind chimes on the porch, a welcome mat that had seen better days but was still serviceable, a small sign near the door that read, "The Brennan Family Est, 1952. Tommy opened the door before Pete could knock, as if he'd been watching from the window. The boy was practically vibrating with excitement, but Pete noticed he was also nervous, fidgeting with the hem of his Reds jersey in a way that suggested the weight of expectations. "He's in the back," Tommy said, leading Pete through a living room that spoke of decades of careful living, furniture that was older but well-maintained, photographs spanning generations, a television playing a Reds game with the sound turned low. Fair warning, he might not believe it's really you at first. Sometimes his memory plays tricks on him. They walked through a kitchen that smelled like fresh coffee and something baking. Chocolate chip cookies, Pete realized, the aroma triggering memories of his own grandmother's kitchen. Through the back door and across a small patio, they arrived at a detached garage that had been converted into a workshop. Frank Brennan was exactly what Pete had expected, and nothing like he'd imagined. The man was tall but stooped, probably 75 or 80, with thick grey hair and hands that showed the calluses and scars of decades of honest work. He was hunched over a workbench, tinkering with what appeared to be an old transistor radio. His movements careful and precise, despite the slight tremor in his fingers. But it was the walls that took Pete's breath away. Every available surface was covered with baseball memorabilia, but not the kind of mass-produced merchandise that filled sports bars and man caves. These were treasures, newspaper clippings preserved behind glass, ticket stubs from significant games, programs from World Series appearances, photographs that captured moments of pure, athletic joy. And prominently displayed, taking up nearly an entire wall, was a shrine to the Big Red Machine. There were action shots of Pete diving into second base, celebrating after clutch hits, arguing with umpires with characteristic passion. There were team photos from the championship years, newspaper headlines declaring victories, and what appeared to be a complete collection of Pete's baseball cards spanning his entire career. "Frank," Tommy said gently, "there's someone here I want you to meet." "No." The older man looked up from his radio, squinting slightly as his eyes adjusted to the figures in the doorway. For a moment, his expression was confused, as if he was trying to place faces that seemed familiar but out of context. Then recognition dawned, and Frank Brennan's entire posture changed. "That's not Tommy, you didn't." "It can't be." Frank set down his screwdriver with shaking hands and rose slowly from his workbench. "Pete Rose? Is that really Pete Rose in my garage?" "Hello, Frank," Pete said, stepping forward with his hand extended. "Tommy told me I should meet the smartest baseball fan in Cincinnati." Frank stared at the offered hand for a moment, then clasped it with both of his own. His grip was still strong despite the tremor, and Pete could feel the emotion in the older man's touch. "I can't believe, after all these years, Charlie Hustle, in my workshop. Your grandson speaks very highly of you, Frank. Says you taught him everything he knows about baseball." "That boy," Frank said, glancing at Tommy with obvious affection. "He's got the love of the game in him, just like his grandma did, God rest her soul. She used to come to games with me, you know, sat through 9 innings in July heat and never complained once. Said watching you play was like watching poetry in motion." Pete felt that familiar tightness in his chest. She had good taste. "I remember those crowds at Riverfront, the way they'd get behind us in the tough moments. Best fans in baseball." "Sit, please," Frank said, gesturing to a pair of folding chairs positioned near the radio. "Tommy, get Mr. Rose something to drink. Coffee, water, I think there's some of that lemonade your mom made." "Coffee's perfect," Pete said, settling into one of the chairs. The garage was comfortable despite its utilitarian nature, clearly a place where Frank spent significant time. Tools were organized with military precision, and Pete noticed several half-finished projects: a wooden birdhouse, what appeared to be a jewelry box, a small rocking horse that was probably intended for a grandchild. "You're handy with tools," Pete observed. "What did you do at Ford?" "Assembly line supervisor, 37 years, Frank replied with obvious pride. "Started on the floor when I got back from Vietnam, worked my way up, built a lot of cars in that time, saw a lot of changes. But the one thing that never changed was baseball season. No matter how tough work got, no matter what was happening in the world, come April, there was always baseball." Tommy returned with coffee in mismatched mugs and a plate of cookies that was still warm from the oven. He settled cross-legged on the concrete floor, clearly content to listen to the adults talk. "Frank, I have to ask about this collection," Pete said, gesturing at the walls. "This is incredible. Some of these photographs, I haven't seen them in decades." Frank's eyes lit up. 40 years of collecting. Started in 70, when you were just hitting your stride. "My wife thought I was crazy spending money on newspapers and programs when we were saving for a house. But she understood. She knew it wasn't just about baseball. It was about hope, about excellence, about watching someone do something better than anyone else in the world." "The 75 World Series," Pete said, nodding toward a framed program. "Tommy told me you were there." "Game 6, Frank said immediately. "Fisk's home run in the 12th inning. I was heartbroken, but I had to admit it was beautiful. Sometimes you lose to something greater than yourself, and you have to respect that." They talked for 2 hours. Frank shared stories from the glory years, the perfect games he'd witnessed, the comebacks that seemed impossible until they happened, the way the city had rallied around the team during the championship runs. Pete found himself sharing memories he rarely discussed. The pressure of chasing records, the camaraderie in the clubhouse, the way it felt to play in front of crowds that lived and died with every pitch. But it was the quieter moments that affected Pete most deeply. The way Frank's face lit up when he talked about teaching Tommy to keep score. The obvious love he had for his deceased wife, mentioned in passing references that spoke of a partnership that had lasted decades. The pride he took in his work, his family, his community. "You know what I always admired about you," Frank said, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. "It wasn't just the hits or the hustle or the records. It was that you played every game like it mattered. Spring training, regular season, World Series, you gave everything you had every single time. That's a lesson that goes beyond baseball." Pete felt something break loose inside his chest. "Frank, I made some mistakes. Big ones. I let people down, let the game down." The older man waved his hand dismissively. "We all make mistakes, Pete. The measure of a man isn't whether he falls down, it's whether he keeps trying to stand back up. You're here, aren't you? You're still fighting, still trying to make things right. That's what matters." Tommy had been quiet for most of the conversation, but now he looked up from where he'd been examining one of his grandfather's baseball cards. "Grandpa says everyone deserves a second chance, especially the people who made their first chances count for something good." The wisdom in those words, coming from a 10-year-old boy, hit Pete harder than any criticism he'd ever received. Here was a family that understood disappointment, that had experienced loss and hardship, but had managed to maintain faith in the possibility of redemption. "I should probably get going," Pete said reluctantly as the first drops of the predicted rain began to patter against the garage roof. "But Frank, this has meant more to me than you know." "The pleasure was all mine," Frank replied, rising from his chair with obvious effort. "You gave me a lot of joy over the years, Pete. More than you'll ever know." As they walked back toward the house, Frank suddenly stopped and turned to Pete. "Would you? This is presumptuous of me to ask, but would you consider coming back sometime? Tommy's got a game next weekend. Little League. He's not bad, got some of that hustle you were famous for." Maybe you could watch him play." Pete looked at Tommy, who was trying to appear casual but clearly hoping for a positive response. "I'd be honored to watch Tommy play." "What time?" "Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, Tommy said quickly. "Hamilton County Youth League, Diamonds behind the community center." "I'll be there," Pete promised, and meant it. As Pete drove home through the summer rain, he found himself thinking about the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories others tell about us. Frank Brennan had spent 40 years collecting memories of Pete's career, preserving them like treasures, sharing them with his grandson as lessons about excellence and perseverance. But the story Pete had been telling himself was different, a narrative of failure and exile, of mistakes that overshadowed achievements, of a legacy tainted by poor judgment. For the first time in years, he began to wonder if both stories could be true simultaneously, if redemption might be less about erasing the past and more about continuing to write new chapters. Tommy Brennan was teaching him to see himself through different eyes. Frank Brennan was reminding him that heroes could be flawed and still be heroes, and Pete Rose was beginning to remember what it felt like to be Charlie Hustle, not because he was chasing records or glory, but because he was chasing something more elusive and more valuable. The chance to be the kind of person a grandfather would want his grandson to meet. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made Cincinnati summers bearable, the humidity temporarily lifted by a front that had moved through overnight. Pete Rose stood in front of his bathroom mirror, running a comb through hair that was more silver than brown these days, and found himself nervous in a way he hadn't experienced since his rookie year. He was going to watch a 10-year-old play Little League baseball. There was no pressure, no stakes, no cameras or reporters or record books, just a kid who'd shown him kindness, playing a game Pete had devoted his life to understanding. Yet, somehow, this felt more important than many of the professional games he'd played. The Hamilton County Community Center sat in a sprawling complex that included playgrounds, walking trails, and 4 baseball diamonds of varying sizes. Pete arrived early, as was his habit, and parked near the smallest field where a handful of parents were already setting up folding chairs and organizing snack schedules. The familiar sounds of a baseball Saturday morning washed over him, gloves popping, players calling to each other during warm-ups, the metallic ping of aluminum bats during practice swings. He spotted Tommy immediately. The boy was at shortstop, fielding ground balls with a seriousness that reminded Pete of his own youth. Tommy's movements were fluid but unpolished, showing natural instincts that hadn't yet been refined by years of professional instruction. He was clearly one of the better players on his team, but what struck Pete most was the boy's constant chatter, encouraging teammates, calling out plays, demonstrating the kind of leadership that couldn't be taught. "You must be Pete Rose." Pete turned to find a woman in her mid-30s approaching with a coffee cup in one hand and a folding chair in the other. She had Tommy's bright blue eyes and sandy hair, though hers was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her smile was warm, but carried a hint of the wariness that Pete had learned to expect from adults. "You must be Tommy's mom," Pete replied, extending his hand. "I'm sorry, he never mentioned your name." "Sarah Brennan. And don't apologize. Tommy's been talking about nothing but baseball legends for the past week. I'm surprised he remembered to tell you which field to find." She gestured toward the diamond, where Tommy was now taking practice swings. "He's been up since 6 this morning, checking and rechecking his equipment. He's a good kid. You should be proud." "I am," Sarah said, and Pete heard both love and exhaustion in her voice. "It hasn't been easy since his dad died 3 years ago. Tommy's grandfather has been..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Dad's health isn't what it used to be. Some days are better than others. Having Tommy to focus on gives him purpose, but it's been an adjustment for all of us." Pete nodded, understanding more now about the family dynamics he'd observed during his visit to Frank's workshop. Frank mentioned that your mother passed away recently too, last September. Mom and Dad were married for 48 years. They were one of those couples who finished each other's sentences. Losing her has been hard on all of us, but especially on Dad. Baseball memories are some of the few things that still bring him consistent joy. They found seats in the small bleacher section, and Pete was pleased to see Frank Brennan making his way slowly across the parking lot, using a walking stick but moving with determination. The older man was wearing a Cincinnati Reds cap that had clearly seen decades of use and a windbreaker despite the warm morning. "Pete!" Frank called out, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "I was hoping you'd make it." "Wouldn't miss it," Pete replied, helping Frank navigate the bleacher steps. "How's our shortstop looking?" "Better than I was at his age, that's for sure," Frank said, settling into the seat Pete had saved for him. "Kid's got good instincts. Sees the whole field, not just where the ball is." The game began with the ritualistic chaos of youth baseball. Parents calling out encouragement, coaches offering last-minute instructions, players adjusting helmets and jerseys with the gravity of professionals preparing for the World Series. Tommy's team, the Cardinals, Pete noted the irony with amusement, was playing a squad from the neighboring township. In the bottom of the first inning, Tommy came to bat with 2 runners on base. Pete watched the boys approach with professional interest, noting the way Tommy took his time in the batter's box, checking his grip, settling his stance, taking a practice swing that showed he'd been taught proper mechanics. "Kid's got patience," Pete observed as Tommy worked the count to 2-1. "That's rare at this age." The next pitch was a fastball down the middle, and Tommy turned on it with surprising authority. The ball sailed over the second baseman's head and into the gap in right center field. Tommy was already running before the ball had crossed the plate, his head down, arms pumping, displaying the kind of hustle that had earned Pete his nickname decades earlier. "That's it," Frank shouted, jumping to his feet with more energy than Pete had seen from him all week. "Run through the bag! Run through it!" Tommy streaked around first base and slid safely into second with a stand-up double that scored both runners. As he stood on the bag, dusting off his uniform pants, he looked into the stands and caught Pete's eye. The grin that spread across his face was pure joy, untainted by ego or expectation. Just a kid who'd done something well and wanted to share the moment with people who mattered to him. "Nice piece of hitting," Pete called out, giving Tommy a thumbs up. The game continued with the ebb and flow that makes baseball compelling at any level. Tommy made 2 sparkling defensive plays, including a diving stop on a grounder up the middle that he converted into a double play with a flip to second base that showed remarkable awareness for a 10-year-old. He also struck out once, on 3 straight curveballs that fooled him completely, but Pete noticed how quickly the boy recovered, encouraging his teammates as they took the field. In the 6th inning, with his team trailing by 1 run and 2 outs, Tommy came to bat again, with the bases loaded. The pressure was obvious. This was the kind of moment that defined Little League seasons, that would be remembered and discussed long after the summer ended. Pete found himself leaning forward, invested in a way that surprised him. This wasn't his game, wasn't his career, wasn't his legacy on the line. But somehow, it mattered more than professional baseball had in years. Tommy stepped into the batter's box and immediately called timeout. Instead of staying at the plate, he jogged over to the fence where his family was sitting. "Grandpa," Tommy called out, "what do you think? What would Charlie Hustle do?" Frank's eyes misted slightly, but his voice was strong. "Charlie Hustle would see the ball and hit the ball. Don't try to do too much, just make contact." Tommy nodded seriously, as if he'd received strategic advice from a major league coach, and trotted back to the plate. Pete felt something tighten in his throat. The boy had just invoked his nickname, his legacy, but in service of something pure and honest rather than commercial or calculated. The pitch was outside, ball 1. Tommy stayed patient. The second pitch was a strike on the corner that Tommy fouled off. The third pitch was a fastball, probably the hardest throw the young pitcher could manage, and Tommy met it squarely. The ball jumped off his bat with a sharp crack that Pete recognized immediately. Solid contact, the kind that feels effortless when everything comes together perfectly. The ball sailed over the left fielder's head and rolled to the fence. Tommy rounded first base, then second, then third, and slid safely into home plate with an inside-the-park grand slam that sent the small crowd into a frenzy. But Pete wasn't watching the celebration. He was watching Tommy as the boy picked himself up from home plate, dusted off his uniform, and looked directly into the stands. The kid didn't pump his fist or showboat or call attention to himself. Instead, he touched the bill of his cap, a small gesture of acknowledgement toward his grandfather, and then jogged back to the dugout to congratulate the teammate who was up next. "Class act," Pete murmured to himself. "Just like his grandfather taught him," Sarah said, and Pete realized she'd been watching him as much as the game. Dad always said baseball was about more than hitting and running. It was about how you carried yourself, how you treated people, whether you made the game better by being part of it. As the game wound down, Tommy's team won 8-5. Pete found himself thinking about the layers of meaning that baseball contained. On the surface, it was a simple game. Hit the ball, catch the ball, run the bases. But underneath, it was about family and tradition, about passing down values and creating memories, about the way sports could connect generations and give shape to summer afternoons. After the game, Tommy jogged over to the stands, his uniform dirty and his face flushed with exertion and pride. Other parents were gathering their children and equipment, but Pete noticed how many of them took a moment to acknowledge Tommy. Not just for his performance, but for his sportsmanship, his encouragement of teammates, his obvious love for the game. "What did you think?" Tommy asked, slightly out of breath. "Was that okay?" "That was better than okay," Pete replied. "That was baseball played the right way. Your grandfather should be proud." "I am proud," Frank said, putting his arm around Tommy's shoulders. "You played with heart, son. You played like Charlie Hustle." The comparison should have felt forced or artificial, but instead it felt natural, organic. Pete realized that Charlie Hustle had never been just about him. It had been about an approach to life, a way of engaging with challenges, a refusal to give less than your best effort. Tommy Brennan embodied that spirit as naturally as breathing. "Mr. Rose," Tommy said, suddenly serious, "would you maybe want to come to more games? I mean, if you're not too busy, we play every Saturday until August." Pete looked at Frank, who was trying to hide a hopeful expression, and at Sarah, who was watching the interaction with the careful attention of a mother protecting her child from potential disappointment. He thought about his usual Saturday routines: memorabilia signings, rounds of golf with old acquaintances, afternoons spent managing his carefully controlled public image. "I'd like that very much," Pete heard himself saying, "if it's okay with your mom and grandfather." "It's more than okay," Sarah said. "It's wonderful. Just, Tommy, don't expect Mr. Rose to be here every week. He's a busy man with important things to do." "Actually," Pete said, "I can't think of anything more important than watching Tommy play baseball." As they walked back to their cars, Frank fell into step beside Pete. The older man was moving slowly, but he seemed energized by the morning's excitement. "Pete," Frank said quietly, "I want you to know what this means to us. Having you here, taking an interest in Tommy, it's more than kindness. It's giving him something to believe in. Frank, he's giving me something to believe in too." They parted ways in the parking lot, but not before making plans for the following Saturday. Pete drove home through neighborhoods he'd known his entire life, past landmarks that held decades of memories, and found himself thinking about the game within the game. Baseball, he was remembering, had never been just about statistics or records or individual achievement. At its core, it was about connection, between players and fans, between generations, between the past and the present, and the possibility of the future. Tommy Brennan was teaching him to see the game through innocent eyes again, to remember why he'd fallen in love with it in the first place. For the first time in years, Pete Rose was looking forward to Saturday. The call came on a Wednesday evening in late July, just as Pete was settling in to watch the Reds game on television. Sarah Brennan's voice was strained, fighting back tears she was clearly trying not to shed. "Mr. Rose, I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call. Dad collapsed this morning. He's at University Hospital. And the doctors say..." Her voice broke completely. "They say it's his heart. Tommy's been asking for you, and I know it's a lot to ask, but..." "I'll be right there," Pete said, already reaching for his keys. "Which floor?" "Cardiac ICU, 4th floor." "Mr. Rose, thank you. This means everything to Tommy and to Dad, too." The drive to University Hospital took Pete through downtown Cincinnati, past the banks of the Ohio River, where he'd played thousands of games at Riverfront Stadium. The summer evening was beautiful, one of those perfect July nights when baseball should be the only thing that mattered. But Pete's mind was focused entirely on a family that had become unexpectedly important to him over the past month. He'd attended 4 of Tommy's games, watching the boy develop not just as a player but as a leader on his team. Tommy's natural instincts were maturing into real baseball intelligence. He was learning to read situations, to anticipate plays, to understand the subtle strategies that separated good players from great ones. But more than that, Pete had watched Tommy navigate the complex social dynamics of youth sports with remarkable grace, encouraging struggling teammates, accepting coaching with humility, demonstrating the kind of character that coaches spent years trying to instill. The hospital's cardiac unit had the sterile, hushed atmosphere that Pete associated with serious illness. He found Sarah in the family waiting area, looking exhausted and younger than her 35 years. Tommy was curled up in a chair beside her, still wearing his baseball uniform from an afternoon game, his glove clutched in his lap like a security blanket. "How is he?" Pete asked, settling into the chair across from them. "Stable for now," Sarah replied. "It was a massive heart attack, but they got him here quickly. The next 24 hours are critical." She looked at Tommy, who had barely acknowledged Pete's arrival. "He's been asking for his grandfather since we got here. I think he's scared that he might not get to say goodbye." Pete studied Tommy's face, noting the tear tracks and the way the boy was staring at his glove as if it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. This was different from the confident, joyful kid Pete had come to know. This was a child confronting mortality for perhaps the first time, trying to process the reality that people you love can disappear without warning. "Tommy," Pete said gently, "can I sit with you for a while?" The boy looked up, and Pete saw a vulnerability that reminded him of his own childhood, of the first time he'd realized that adults, even the strongest, most reliable adults, were fragile and temporary. Tommy nodded silently and scooted over to make room on the couch. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the ambient sounds of the hospital, distant conversations, the soft ping of elevators, the squeak of wheelchairs moving down polished corridors. Finally, Tommy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he going to die?" The question hung in the air with devastating simplicity. Pete looked at Sarah, who was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a mother who understood that her son was growing up too fast, learning lessons she wished she could shield him from. "I don't know, Tommy," Pete replied honestly, "but I know your grandfather is one of the toughest men I've ever met, and I know he's fighting because he has something very important to fight for." "What's that?" "You, your mom. All the Saturday games he hasn't watched yet. All the stories about baseball he hasn't finished telling you." Tommy absorbed this, turning his glove over in his hands with the unconscious repetition of someone seeking comfort through familiar objects. Grandpa taught me everything about baseball. Everything about being a good person, too. If he dies, who's going to teach me the rest? The question cut through Pete like a line drive to the chest. Here was a 10-year-old boy confronting the fundamental loneliness of human existence, the realization that the people who shape us and guide us won't always be there, that eventually we all have to find our own way through the complexities of life. Tommy, your grandfather didn't just teach you baseball. He taught you how to learn, how to pay attention, how to treat people with respect. Those are the tools you need to keep learning from everyone you meet. Your mom, your coaches, your teammates, even old broken-down ball players like me. A small smile flickered across Tommy's face. You're not broken down. You're Charlie Hustle. Maybe I used to be. Maybe I can be again if I keep learning from people like you and your grandfather. They talked quietly for the next hour, Pete sharing stories from his own childhood about losing people he cared about the way grief could feel overwhelming, but gradually became something you carried rather than something that carried you. Sarah joined the conversation occasionally, but mostly she listened, clearly grateful that someone else was helping her son process emotions that were too big for a 10-year-old to handle alone. At 9 o'clock, a doctor emerged from the cardiac unit, looking tired but not defeated. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the kind of calm competence that Pete associated with professionals who'd learned to deliver difficult news with compassion. He's stable, she announced without preamble. The next few days will be crucial, but he's responding well to treatment. He's asking for his family. Can we see him? Sarah asked. 2 at a time and only for a few minutes. He needs rest, but I think seeing you will help his recovery. Sarah and Tommy went in first, leaving Pete alone in the waiting room with his thoughts. Through the large windows, he could see the Cincinnati skyline, dotted with lights that marked the offices and apartments and restaurants where people were going about their normal lives, unaware that in this hospital room, a family was confronting the possibility of fundamental change. 20 minutes later, Tommy emerged from his grandfather's room, looking simultaneously relieved and worried. Frank was alive, awake, and asking questions about Saturday's game, but he was also connected to machines and monitors that made his mortality impossible to ignore. He wants to see you, Tommy told Pete, but Mum says only for a minute. Pete followed Sarah back into the cardiac unit, past rooms filled with the quiet drama of people fighting for their lives. Frank's room was small and efficient, dominated by medical equipment that beeped and hummed with electronic vigilance. But Frank Brennan, despite the tubes and wires, looked remarkably like himself, alert, focused, and genuinely pleased to see Pete. Charlie Hustle, Frank said, his voice hoarse but strong. Sorry to drag you away from whatever important thing you were doing. Watching the Reds lose to Pittsburgh, Pete replied. This is definitely more important. Frank chuckled, a sound that seemed to surprise both him and the machines, monitoring his vital signs. How's our shortstop holding up? He's scared, but he's tough. Reminds me of his grandfather. Pete, Frank said, his tone becoming more serious. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course. If something happens to me, if I don't make it through this, would you look out for Tommy? Not financially. Sarah's got that handled. But the baseball stuff, the life lessons, the things a grandfather is supposed to teach a boy, would you consider being that person for him? The request hit Pete like a fastball he hadn't seen coming. Frank wasn't asking him to replace a grandfather. That was impossible. He was asking him to continue a conversation, to help a boy navigate the complexities of growing up with the wisdom that came from experience and mistakes and hard-won understanding. Frank, you're going to be fine. The doctor said I'm stable, which is different from fine. Pete, I'm 76 years old. I've had 2 heart attacks and my wife died less than a year ago. I'm not afraid of dying, But I'm afraid of leaving Tommy without someone who understands what it means to love baseball and life in equal measure. Pete looked through the room's window, where he could see Tommy pacing in the hallway, still clutching his baseball glove. The boy was trying to be strong for his mother, but Pete could see the fear and uncertainty in every step. "I'd be honored," Pete said finally. "But I'm going to hold you accountable for getting better, so I don't have to do this alone." Frank smiled, and for a moment the years and the illness fell away, revealing the young man who'd spent 37 years building cars and 40 years collecting baseball memories. "Deal. But just in case, there's something I want you to have." Frank gestured toward a small bag on the bedside table. "Sarah brought it from home. Open it." Inside the bag was a baseball, but not just any baseball. It was clearly vintage, the leather worn to a rich brown patina, the seams darkened with age and use. But what made Pete's breath catch was the signature, his own autograph in blue ink that had faded but remained legible after decades. "You signed that for me in 1976, after Game 7 of the World Series," Frank explained. "I was working security at the stadium, and you were walking to the team bus. I called out to you, said I'd been watching you play since you were a rookie, that you'd given me and my family years of joy. You stopped, took this ball out of your equipment bag, signed it and handed it to me. You said thanks for being a fan, and thanks for sticking with us through the tough times too." Pete stared at the ball, trying to remember that October night 43 years ago. The World Series loss had been devastating, the end of the Big Red Machine era, the beginning of his individual pursuit of records that would eventually overshadow team achievements. He could barely remember signing autographs that night, but he could imagine doing it. The ritual of connecting with fans who'd supported the team through good seasons and bad. "I can't take this," Pete said. "This is your treasure, your memory. It's my memory, but it's going to be Tommy's future," Frank replied. "That boy loves you, Pete. Not because you're famous, but because you've treated him with kindness and respect. You've shown him that heroes can be real people, that greatness comes from how you treat others as much as what you accomplish for yourself." Pete felt tears he hadn't expected threatening to spill down his cheeks. "Frank, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I've made mistakes, big ones. I've disappointed people." "We all make mistakes," Frank said, echoing the conversation they'd had in his workshop weeks earlier. "The question is whether we learn from them, whether we use them to become better people. You've spent 30 years paying for your mistakes, Pete. Maybe it's time to start using them to help someone else avoid making the same ones." A nurse appeared in the doorway, indicating that visiting hours were ending. Pete carefully tucked the baseball into his jacket pocket, feeling its weight like a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. "Get some rest," Pete told Frank. "Tommy needs his grandfather at Saturday's game." "I'll do my best," Frank replied. "But Pete, promise me you'll be there either way. Promise me Tommy won't have to face that alone." "I promise." And then, as Pete left the hospital, Tommy and Sarah walking beside him toward the parking garage, he found himself thinking about promises and the weight they carried. Frank Brennan was asking him to be more than a friend or mentor to Tommy. He was asking him to be a bridge between the boy's past and future, to help carry forward the values and wisdom that had shaped 3 generations of Brennan men. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Tommy asked as they reached Pete's car. "Every day until your grandfather comes home," Pete replied. "And after that?" Pete looked at this remarkable boy who'd somehow become central to his life in just a few weeks, who'd reminded him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about writing a better future. "After that too, Tommy, for as long as you want me around." As Pete drove home through the quiet Cincinnati streets, he found himself thinking about the unexpected ways life could change direction. 6 weeks ago, He'd been going through the motions of managed public appearances and careful reputation rehabilitation. Now he was part of a family's crisis, invested in a 10-year-old's development, carrying a baseball that represented 43 years of connection between a player and a fan. Frank Brennan might recover completely, or he might not. But either way, Pete Rose had made a promise that would change both his life and Tommy's. For the first time in decades, Pete wasn't thinking about his own legacy. He was thinking about the legacy he could help create for someone else. Charlie Hustle was learning to hustle for something more important than records or recognition. He was hustling for the chance to be the kind of person a dying grandfather would trust with his grandson's future. Frank Brennan died on a Tuesday morning in late August, 3 weeks after his heart attack and 2 days before Tommy's championship game. He went peacefully in his sleep, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated wear of 76 years of hard living and deep loving. Sarah called Pete at dawn, her voice steady but hollow, carrying the peculiar exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love fight a battle they ultimately can't win. "He's gone," she said simply. Sometime during the night, the nurses said it was peaceful. Pete dressed quickly and drove to the hospital, arriving to find Tommy sitting in the same waiting room chair where he'd spent so many hours over the previous weeks, still wearing his pajamas under a hastily thrown-on jacket. The boy wasn't crying. He'd moved past tears into that numb space where grief transforms into something too big for immediate emotional response. "Hey, buddy," Pete said, settling into the chair beside him. "He's really gone," Tommy said, not as a question but as a statement he was trying to make real through repetition. "Mom says he's not hurting anymore, that he's with Grandma now, but he's not going to see me play on Saturday." The championship game. Pete had forgotten about it in the immediate shock of Frank's death, but of course Tommy would be thinking about it. The boy had been looking forward to this game for weeks, knowing it would be the culmination of his best season yet, excited about the possibility of his grandfather watching from the stands one more time. "No, he won't be in the stands," Pete agreed. "But that doesn't mean he won't be there." Tommy looked at him with the skeptical expression of a child who'd been given too many well-meaning platitudes over the past few weeks. That's what adults say when they can't think of anything else. Pete smiled despite the circumstances. Even in grief, Tommy's honesty was refreshing. "You're right. Adults do say that when they can't think of anything better, but in this case, it's also true. Your grandfather is going to be there because everything he taught you, every piece of advice he gave you, every moment he spent showing you how to be a good person and a good ball player, that's all going to be with you when you step into the batter's box. It's not the same. No, it's not. It's different, and it's harder, and it's unfair, but it's also the way life works sometimes. The people who matter most to us don't get to stay forever, but if we're lucky, they stick around long enough to teach us how to carry on without them." The funeral was held on Thursday at a small Catholic church in Price Hill, the same sanctuary where Frank and his wife had been married 48 years earlier. Pete sat in the back, not wanting to intrude on family and longtime friends who had deeper claims to grief than his recent friendship with Frank warranted. But he noticed the baseball displayed among the flowers near the casket. The same ball Frank had given him in the hospital, now returned as a symbol of the connection between grandfather and the game he'd loved. Tommy spoke at the service, reading from a letter he'd written to his grandfather. His voice was steady, though Pete could see his hands shaking as he held the paper. "Grandpa taught me that baseball is a lot like life," Tommy read. "Sometimes you get a hit, sometimes you strike out, but you always have to keep stepping up to the plate. He taught me that how you play the game matters more than whether you win or lose, and that the best players are the ones who make their teammates better. Most importantly, he taught me that love is something you do, not just something you feel. You show love by paying attention, by being there when people need you, by passing on the things that matter most." Pete found himself thinking about promises and the weight they carried. He'd given Frank his word that he would look out for Tommy, help guide the boy through the complexities of growing up without losing sight of the values his grandfather had instilled. It was a responsibility Pete had never anticipated taking on, but sitting in that church, listening to Tommy speak with wisdom beyond his years, Pete felt the promise settling around him like a familiar uniform. After the service, as people gathered in the church fellowship hall for the traditional meal and shared memories, Tommy approached Pete with a small wrapped package. "This is for you," Tommy said. "Grandpa asked me to give it to you after he was gone." Inside the package was a photograph Pete had never seen. Frank Brennan as a young man, probably in his early 20s, wearing a Cincinnati Reds cap and grinning at the camera. He was standing next to Pete during what appeared to be a spring training session, both of them laughing at something off camera. On the back, in Frank's careful handwriting, was a note. "Pete, March 1973, Sarasota. Thanks for taking time to talk baseball with a fan. You probably don't remember this, but it was one of the best days of my life. Now you know why I trusted you with Tommy. Frank." Pete stared at the photograph, trying to place the memory. 1973 would have been early in his career, before the Big Red Machine had fully formed, when he was still just a promising young player rather than a record-chasing legend. He could barely remember the specific moment, but he could imagine it, taking a few minutes to chat with a fan during the informal atmosphere of spring training, both of them young and optimistic about the season ahead. "He kept this for 46 years, Tommy said. "He told me it was proof that you were always the kind of person who cared about people, not just baseball. He said that's why he knew you'd keep your promise." Saturday morning arrived gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that made even movement feel like effort. The championship game was being played at the county's premier youth baseball facility, with actual dugouts and a press box and bleachers that could accommodate several hundred spectators. Tommy's team, the Cardinals, was playing for the 12 and under title against a squad from the eastern suburbs that had dominated their division all season. Pete arrived early, carrying a folding chair and a cooler filled with water bottles, small gestures that had become routine over the summer. Sarah was already there, looking exhausted but determined, wearing one of Frank's old Reds caps and clutching a scorebook that showed the careful attention to detail her father had taught her. "How's he doing?" Pete asked, nodding toward Tommy, who was warming up with his teammates near the first base line. "Nervous, but focused," Sarah replied. "He was up at 5 this morning checking his equipment and practicing his swing in the backyard. I think he knows this is bigger than just a game." Pete watched Tommy go through his pre-game routine, noting the way the boy's movements had become more fluid and confident over the course of the summer. Tommy was clearly one of the better players on his team, but more importantly, he was the emotional leader. The kid other players looked to for encouragement and guidance, the one who kept everyone focused when momentum shifted. The game began with the kind of intensity Pete associated with October baseball. Both teams had clearly prepared extensively, and the quality of play was remarkably high for 10 and 11-year-olds. Tommy's counterpart at shortstop for the opposing team was equally skilled, and Pete found himself appreciating the strategic complexity of what was supposedly just a children's game. In the top of the third inning, with his team trailing 2-1, Tommy came to bat with runners on first and second. The opposing pitcher was the best Tommy had faced all season, a kid who threw harder than most and had developed a legitimate curveball that was fooling even experienced young hitters. Pete found himself leaning forward, invested in the outcome in a way that surprised him. This wasn't professional baseball, where careers and contracts and historical records hung in the balance. But somehow it felt more important than many major league games he'd played, because it was about a boy honoring his grandfather's memory and everything he'd been taught about perseverance and character. Tommy took the first pitch, a fastball that caught the corner for a strike. The second pitch was a curveball that broke low and outside, evening the count. Pete could see Tommy adjusting his approach, shortening his swing slightly, focusing on making contact rather than trying to overpower the ball. The third pitch was another fastball, and Tommy turned on it with authority. The ball jumped off his bat with that distinctive sound Pete knew so well, solid contact, the kind that felt effortless when everything came together perfectly. The ball sailed over the left fielder's head and rolled to the fence, easily scoring both runners and giving Tommy a stand-up triple that put his team ahead 3-2. But Pete wasn't watching the scoreboard. He was watching Tommy as the boy reached third base, touched the bag, and looked up into the stands. For a moment, Tommy's eyes searched the bleachers, clearly looking for someone who wasn't there. Then his gaze found Pete, and the boy touched the bill of his cap, a small gesture that had become their signal over the summer. "For Grandpa," Tommy mouthed, and Pete felt something break open in his chest. The game continued with the back-and-forth drama that makes baseball compelling at any level. Tommy made several outstanding defensive plays, including a diving catch on a line drive that robbed the opposing team of what would have been the go-ahead hit. In the bottom of the sixth inning, with his team clinging to a 4-3 lead, Tommy struck out swinging at a curveball that fooled him completely. As he walked back to the dugout, Pete could see the disappointment on the boy's face, the kind of personal frustration that comes from feeling like you've let your teammates down in a crucial moment. But instead of dwelling on the failure, Tommy immediately began encouraging the next batter, offering tactical advice based on what he'd learned from his own at-bat. The game ended with Tommy's team winning 5-3, a victory that sent the small crowd of parents and siblings into jubilant celebration. Pete watched the post-game ritual of handshakes and team photos, noting how Tommy conducted himself with the kind of gracious sportsmanship that would have made Frank proud. As the celebration began to wind down and families started packing their chairs and coolers, Tommy jogged over to where Pete was sitting. "We won," Tommy said, his grin wide but somehow incomplete. "You played beautifully," Pete replied. "Your grandfather would have been so proud of how you handled yourself out there. It doesn't feel the same without him here." Pete nodded, understanding completely. "It never will feel the same, Tommy. But that doesn't mean it can't still be meaningful. Your grandfather spent 40 years watching baseball because it connected him to the things he valued most: excellence, perseverance, the importance of being part of something bigger than yourself. Every time you step on that field and play with the kind of integrity he taught you, you're honoring his memory." Tommy considered this, absently tossing his glove from hand to hand. "Pete, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you going to keep coming to my games? I know you probably have more important things to do now that Grandpa's gone, and I don't want you to feel like you have to because of some promise or anything." Pete felt the question hit him like a fastball to the chest. Here was this remarkable boy who'd just lost the most important person in his life, worrying that he might also lose someone else who'd become significant to him. Tommy was trying to give Pete an out, trying to make it easy for him to drift away now that Frank was no longer there to bind them together. "Tommy," Pete said, pulling the boy aside for a private conversation, "I need you to understand something. I didn't make that promise to your grandfather because I felt obligated. I made it because you and your family have given me something I didn't know I was missing. You've reminded me why I fell in love with baseball in the first place, and more importantly, you've shown me what it means to be the kind of person who makes other people's lives better. I don't understand. For 30 years, I've been trying to figure out how to make up for the mistakes I made, how to earn back the respect I lost, how to rebuild a reputation that I damaged with my own poor choices. But watching you play, talking to your grandfather, being part of your family's life, that's taught me something important. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about using your experience to help create a better future for someone else." Tommy was listening with the serious attention he usually reserved for batting instruction or strategic discussions about situational baseball. "I'm not going anywhere, Tommy. I'm going to keep coming to your games. I'm going to keep teaching you everything I know about baseball and life, and I'm going to keep learning from you about what it means to be a good person. That's not a burden or an obligation. That's a privilege." The smile that spread across Tommy's face was pure joy, the kind of expression that reminded Pete why connecting with young people was so important and so rewarding. Here was a boy who'd endured loss and uncertainty, but still maintained faith in the possibility of meaningful relationships, still believed that adults could be trusted to keep their promises. "Does this mean you'll teach me how to steal second base?" Tommy asked, his tone shifting from serious to playful. "Grandpa always said you were the smartest base runner he ever saw." Pete laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Kid, I'll teach you everything I know. But first, let's go celebrate this championship with your mom and teammates. Your grandfather may not have been in the stands today, but he was definitely watching." As they walked back toward the celebration, Pete found himself thinking about the unexpected ways life could change direction, the surprising sources of redemption and meaning that could emerge from the most ordinary moments. 6 months ago, he'd been trapped in a cycle of managed public appearances and careful reputation rehabilitation, going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly hollow. Now, he was part of a family's ongoing story, invested in a remarkable young man's development, committed to carrying forward the values and wisdom that Frank Brennan had spent a lifetime accumulating and sharing. Tommy would grow up and eventually move beyond the need for a surrogate grandfather's guidance, but Pete suspected that the lessons he learned from this relationship would last far longer than anything else he'd accomplished in his 78 years. Pete Rose had spent his entire adult life chasing records and recognition, pursuing individual achievements that would secure his place in baseball history. But standing in the parking lot of a youth baseball complex on a humid August afternoon, watching Tommy Brennan celebrate with his teammates while his mother beamed with pride and joy, Pete realized he'd found something more valuable than any statistic or Hall of Fame plaque. He'd found his way back to Charlie Hustle, not the player who'd accumulated 4,856 hits, but the person who understood that the greatest victories came from helping others succeed, from keeping promises that mattered, from showing up when showing up was the most important thing you could do. The championship trophy would eventually find its place in Tommy's bedroom, alongside the other mementos of a summer that had transformed both their lives. But the real prize, the relationship between a boy who needed guidance and a man who needed purpose, would endure long after the last game had been played and the final statistics had been recorded. Some stories end with grand gestures and dramatic revelations. Others conclude with the quiet satisfaction of promises kept and connections made. Pete Rose's story with Tommy Brennan was definitely the latter, a reminder that redemption often comes not from erasing our mistakes, but from using them to become the kind of person someone else needs us to be. As they drove home through the familiar Cincinnati streets, Pete found himself humming an old Johnny Cash tune his father used to play, thinking about grandfathers and grandchildren, about the stories we tell and the legacies we leave behind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight was for celebration and gratitude, and the simple pleasure of knowing that some promises are worth keeping, no matter how heavy they might feel when we first accept their weight. Charlie Hustle had found his way home,